Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Simple Handicap Podcast. This episode's hosted live on the RAS Picks YouTube channel. Lots going on, lots to talk about. A full NFL headline reaction show for anybody joining in live with comments. Drop them in the comment section. I'll get to those as we go through the different topics. You guys bring up what you want to hear about. I'll be able to answer it as we go live. Happy to be back with the first NFL show here on the YouTube channel as well as the podcast feed since the offseason has started. First one from the new house, first one from the new office. Got to meet a couple of people semi-unintentionally in the new city so far. Saw David over at Urban Golf. Also saw Jared over at OEB having some breakfast. If you are a listener of the show or you're tuning in, you're in the Saskatoon area, please drop me a message over on Twitter, or you can reach out through any other platform. Would love to meet up, whether it's a beer, whether it's an hour in the sim golf, whether it's on the golf course as well. Do let me know. I'll be happy to meet up anytime here in the new city. So happy to be settled in, happy to be looking forward to NFL reaction. Ron Mexico starting off with a comment. BOL release a total shit show coming in complimentary. So Ron, if you had any issues during the show, we can get you connected with Dave over at BOL. He'll be happy to help out and sort out anything that might have went wrong. Just send a direct message over on Twitter. We'll be happy to pass any info you have along, and then he'll be able to help you out with some stuff on his end as well. For those of you who missed the release show from Wednesday morning, we're partnering with Bet Online, where they're willing to hold the line for 30 seconds afterwards, taking bets up to $500, so nobody has to rush. It was a pilot episode. Think back to the Seinfeld pilot episode as a very unrealistic comparison. The difference between that and shows in season one were pretty drastic. And so this was the first time we tried it. I believe there were some tech issues on their side. I don't know exactly what went on, but something with the bet slip when you were adding it from the special menu just doesn't work out. So that's going to be sorted out for the Thursday show. Episode 2 is going to be better than episode 1. Episode 3 is going to be better than episode 2. But Ron, if you had any issues, send a direct message on Twitter. We'll forward it over to Dave, and he'll be able to take care of it. And he's going to be watching for any other comments that come up on Twitter to sort everything out. The intent of the show is not to cause problems for people. It's to try allow everybody to get down at the right price without having to rush, as a pretty good product integration and tie in to the release show. And so I get that there were a couple issues potentially. Just send the message. We'll sort it out, and Dave will take care of you on the side of Bet Online. All right, let's get to the first topic. These go back a couple of days, so it's kind of a full, we'll call it the last 10 days of catch-up since just before the Combine, through the Combine, and into now, leading into free agency next week. We'll try to do another one of these shows here on YouTube in the next couple of days as well. And so we'll catch up with some of the older news. We'll get to some of the current news and then some of the stuff that we've heard today as well. Topic number one that I want to give my thoughts on: Deebo Samuel traded to Washington. This can go a couple different ways from a standpoint of, is it a fit? Is it a win? Who got the best of it? Is Deebo cooked? Is his career coming to an end and falling off? Lots of different directions to kind of look at and tackle. So I think the first one that I really want to stress is, last year, any player involved on the San Francisco 49ers is a really tough evaluation. They were the most injured offense in the entire NFL. They were top 5 in terms of banned games lost on both sides of the football. It was a disastrous season for injuries. I did a TikTok video earlier in the week. It had to be 4.5 minutes long because of all the guys that were hurt, especially on the offensive side. Like, just a disaster for injuries. And so that, to me, really skews not only the perception of the 49ers, but just any evaluation that comes from players that were part of that team last year and where they're going to end up this year. And so I do believe that Deebo, who went through the pneumonia issues, was never quite the same coming back from that, gets a little bit of slack for that. I don't think the weight comments and him confirming that he was overweight and everything that went was an intentional decision. I think there were some lingering impacts there that just lessened that a little bit. I also think Deebo gets a bit of slack because once Brandon Ayuk went down in the 7th game of the season, defenses completely changed how they defended the San Francisco 49ers offense. This has been a very matchup-dependent offense under Kyle Shanahan that just exposes mismatches. And so when teams would come in and have a more man-centric defense, those would turn out to be very big games for Brandon Ayuk. When defenses would come in that were very zone-centric, try to play a lot of zone, those would become big games for Deebo Samuel and even George Kittle. Once Brandon Ayuk went down, the 49ers lost a massive mismatch piece in being able to take advantage of a lot of man coverage looks. Once he went down, defenses went and played a lot of man coverage. And not only was Deebo going up against coverages where he's historically performed significantly worse than against zone, some of the PFF rankings have him ranked around 90th for wide receiver ratings when facing man coverage. But he was also put into being wide receiver number one. Something that I think everybody knows watching this is Deebo Samuel can never be a wide receiver number one option for an offense in the NFL in 2025. So not only was he dealing with some of the injuries, not only was he dealing with different defensive coverages because of other injuries to other players, but then he was forced into being a number one wide receiver. And that was just a disaster for San Francisco. And it would be for any team that tries to have Samuel as wide receiver number one. And so all of that kind of, I think, lessens the blow of how bad he looked at times. Now, thinking forward to Washington, I think a lot of the fits in this offense make a ton of sense. He's going to be wide receiver number two across from Terry McLaurin, who is one of the best wide receivers in the NFL. So that wide receiver 1-2 split, you don't have to worry about. I think it's a nice landing spot for him from that perspective. Thinking about what the Washington Commanders offense is, ton of screen passes, one of the highest screen pass rates in the NFL, big focus on yards after the catch. And both of those things fit into what Deebo Samuel excels at. From that perspective, I think it's a pretty good fit and a pretty good landing spot for him. It's also ties to Peters at the GM spot with his history to San Francisco, knowing how to use him, knowing how to deploy him. And so I think there's a lot of potential positives here. There's going to be the question of how overweight was he? Was the slow, were the drops? Like, was that just a career starting to go into decline? Possibly. I don't want to say that it's completely not. But in terms of landing spots and where he could go, I think Washington makes a ton of sense. And if you're a Commanders fan, you have to be pretty excited about the prospect of having him up there. And so that, to me, I think is kind of the summary on Deebo Samuel in this trade to Washington. In terms of the cap, I'm not a salary cap expert. I'm not going to go into like large depths on the cap hits and what it means. That's not my area of expertise. I would say that anybody who's looking at this as a silly mistake by the 49ers because they have to eat the dead cap money even with him gone, David Lombardi, who covers the 49ers, had a really good breakdown of why this is actually a pretty wise cap move for San Francisco, what it looks like with the carryover next year and what it looks like in subsequent seasons. And so there's actually a lot of positives to come from that. I'll leave that to the salary cap experts, but I think that perspective is important if you're looking at it from this perspective. Question here from Bruce says, I was able to get 143 10 minutes after release at BetOnline. So they actually messaged us right after and said that there were some things that were screwed up. They left the market open in the hold the line spot, and that was true. You could have got over 143 for about 10 to 50 minutes after. They just left it up in the menu. Again, if anybody had issues and you're watching the live stream, send us a message on Twitter. We'll forward it over to Dave, and he'll be able to sort everything out for everybody. Next question is Sam Darnold not tagged by the Minnesota Vikings? This was a big domino in free agency at the quarterback position. And the expectation, and why I think this is notable news and a notable headline, is that the Vikings were going to tag Sam Darnold and then try to shop around trade opportunities leading into the draft to see where they could move him. By not tagging Sam Darnold, what I interpret that as is the Vikings not getting a lot of trade buzz or trade interest through meetings and the combine and other teams wanting to add Sam Darnold to their roster in exchange for other picks and compensation. And so with that being said, it's a pretty interesting topic to think about and discuss, because as we look forward to free agency and what this might mean for Darnold and how the Vikings may elect to handle them, it's very seldom that you see a quarterback coming off of a 4,300-yard season with 35 touchdowns and 12 picks not having a certain home in the upcoming year. You don't see that happening very often, and you don't see that happening where there's not a lot of interest for the quarterback. I think this is enormous praise for Kevin O'Connell and what he was able to get out of that offense with Sam Darnold last season. And the fact that other teams around the league are perhaps looking at this, believing more about what they saw in Sam Darnold in the final 2 games of the season, more so than believing the first 15 games of the season, I think is pretty telling to what Sam Darnold is as a quarterback. And so you start to look now at potential spots where Darnold could end up, where he could go, what he could look at if the Vikings elect to go forward with J.J. McCarthy. To me, the number one landing spot that makes a ton of sense would be the Indianapolis Colts. The Colts are trying to get competition for Richardson. Shane Steichen wants to treat it as a true competition going into the season. Darnold is not obviously nearly as mobile as Richardson, but we did see at times some of his mobility, which I think is somewhat underrated, be able to be opened up in the Minnesota offense. So I don't think that Steichen is left out to dry with some of the option concepts that he wants to work into the offense, like he was with, say, Gardner Minshew in times when Anthony Richardson was injured. I think Darnold can fill that and be suitable in that role. And so I'm curious to see, are the Colts, who want that true QB competition, going to pursue Sam Darnold? Is that potentially a good landing spot? And we'll see what comes of that. But it seems like now, without the decision to tag Darnold, the Minnesota Vikings are going to go forward with J.J. McCarthy as their quarterback, and that's pretty significant. Kyle's asking what happens with Danny Dimes. It's a good question. I saw speculation this morning that a team like the Colts could also be interested in him. Perhaps they might be viewing him as a more mobile option than what they could potentially get from Sam Darnold. I think it's an intriguing fit. Ben Solak over at ESPN did a pretty good article about quarterbacks who end up going to another team after drafted with these second chances. We've seen a big resurgence of it. A lot of quarterbacks just end up in a position where they don't fit, or they're stuck in an offense that wasn't tailored for them. They end up going somewhere else at a pretty cheap discount, and then all of a sudden they're opened up into a new offense, and we can finally see some of the ceiling and some of the good aspects of their games sort of accentuated. And so that, to me, could be potential for Daniel Jones, especially if he goes, again, I think a landing spot like Indy for either of these quarterbacks, Darnold or Jones, is a really good landing spot in that Steichen offense. And so I'll be curious to see if they pursue either of these quarterbacks starting next Wednesday once the free agency window opens. But it's a good question about what happens with Jones. Next topic is Matthew Stafford signed by the LA Rams. This one's pretty significant. Now, the details haven't been released. It's going to likely be a 1-year raise more so than it is an extension. The details of that have not been released. We'll probably get that, obviously, at some point coming up in the next week or so. Speculation is it's near the $50 million mark as a raise for the one season. And the Rams are kind of buying into this 1 more year scenario with Stafford. Last year, it was down to the wire to begin camp, where Stafford was risking holding out. Allegedly, it was like 10 minutes before things got going where he was willing to come in and participate. And so, to me, everything about how the Stafford angle was handled was the Rams potentially calling his bluff, but also hearing that the Giants offered potentially more money than he is willing to take from the Rams, and allegedly did take. I think is pretty intriguing about his intentions wanting to stay in LA, the Rams wanting to make it work. But it's been kind of an accelerated timeline for the LA Rams, because what was honestly a bit of a rebuild or a reset the last year and a half has turned into a scenario where the Rams go from that into really a win now mode. Their defense last year progressed at a rate I don't think anybody expected to happen, not even people within the Rams organization. All of these young guys on the LA defensive side just clicked. And a lot of it came after the bye, and that defense just kept getting better and better and better and better as the season went on. And so now the Rams, again, 1 drive away from beating the Eagles in the playoffs, all of a sudden go from a bit of a reset and a rebuild to full-on win-now mode. They secure Stafford, very likely to move on from Cooper Kupp. But there's now options once they solve some of the stuff on the offensive line where they're moving around. But, man, there's options here for the Rams to add another pass catcher, try get someone for a little bit cheaper to add into this offense. I mean, this is a loaded offense. This is a defense that's now very different, but improving in a big way. The Rams do have a couple of picks, unlike past seasons. There's a lot of potential here for what the Rams could build and develop. I look at them as a favorite in the NFC. I sent out a tweet yesterday as the Westgate sent out Super Bowl exactas. They posted them yesterday on the app, and I said it was way too early. But to me, Bills Rams Super Bowl exacta for 2025. I know it's early. It's hard to ignore the upside of both of those teams going into 2025 now that the Rams have the QB position secured. Now, the negativity that's around this and the questions about, like, why did you do it if you're on the Rams side of things, was a lot of people referencing that Matthew Stafford had his worst career season last year with the Rams. He's obviously getting older. My counter to that would be, I think back to just how many injuries the Rams had on the offensive line at the skill positions in the first 6, 7, 8 weeks of the season. I mean, this was a team that was absolutely decimated with injuries. And that Lions game to begin the season, they could barely finish the game because they didn't have enough offensive linemen on the bench to come in for all the starters who were injured. Although you might dub it as his worst season ever, after the bye in the final 13 weeks of the season, and plus the playoffs, 4th in EPA per play, 3rd in success rate was Matthew Stafford throwing the football. And so some pretty drastic splits for Stafford and for that offense without injuries that I don't think can be quite ignored. And so I don't know if I'm fully buying into that worst career year ever. And a lot of that is tied into some of the pressure and decisions that Stafford was making. And again, I think that's directly tied into some of the issues the Rams were having up front that they're obviously going to be able to figure out in this offseason if they're going to make a run in this 1 year kind of all-in scenario. Next question up is T. Higgins tagged by the Cincinnati Bengals. And there's a lot to talk about with the Cincinnati Bengals. To me, one of the more interesting teams of the entire offseason to look at, to talk about, to speculate, because they are going to be a very popular Super Bowl pick for many, just based on how they finished the season last year, on all the upside, on all the players. T. Higgins gets the tag. There's still no word on the Jamar Chase deal, but there's a few things to think about and kind of put in the back of your mind as this is happening. The first one is, last season, T. Higgins switched his agent, and he now has the same agent as Jamar Chase. That move, I think, was a bit strategic, knowing how both of those guys are absolutely key to the Bengals. We're hearing Burrow wants them back. We're hearing the coaching staff wants them back. Ownership, allegedly, and Tobin want him back. Now they're kind of tied together, and it's being negotiated as a bit of a package deal. And so I think that's a pretty advantageous spot for Higgins to be in. All signs point to Chase being paid. All signs now point to Higgins being paid. The problem, I think, that's holding things up is the Bengals as a franchise just do not go out of their way to give away a lot of guaranteed money. And I have to think that that's the holdup right now, because there's no rationale for why the Bengals cannot push to get these deals done. I think it's essential, and I think it would be silly if they're not going out of their way to get these deals done as soon as possible. And I say that because this is a Bengals team that has gone through so many issues in the preseason since drafting Joe Burrow. They've just never had a drama-free offseason. And Joe Burrow has never had an uninterrupted preseason and training camp and offseason of prep. And it constantly leads to the Bengals starting season slow. So just think about what's gone on in the timeline of Joe Burrow since he's been a quarterback for the Cincinnati Bengals. In 2020, it was COVID. All preseason games were canceled. Welcome to the NFL. No preseason. The Bengals start 0-2-1 in the first 3 weeks of the regular season. 2021, Burrow's coming back from the ACL injury. Doesn't play in training camp, doesn't play in preseason. I think there was 3 snaps total that he was involved with, effectively doing nothing. Bengals come out 2-1 start. Their best start in the first 3 weeks of the season with Joe Burrow. 2022, he ruptures his appendix, misses all of preseason, misses a chunk of camp. Bengals start 1-2. 2023, calf strain in the second practice of camp, misses the rest of camp, misses the rest of preseason, 1-2 again. 2024, last year, Jamar Chase with the hold in, hold out, whatever you want to call it. This offense with Burrow finally healthy, with him finally participating, goes through camp and preseason without their biggest offensive weapon. They end up sorting things out late. Chase admits it was a slow start to the season because he didn't have the workouts. Burrow talks about how it was a slow start to the season. Bengals start 0-3, and they're out of the playoffs before they even have a chance to recover. I mean, it's every year the Bengals just do nothing to prevent this from happening. And now all the opportunity is there to prevent it from happening. And I think this deal with Higgins, and if they get it done with Chase, and this offense is just settled, that's when there's real upside in this team from the Super Bowl, from the futures markets, whatever you want to look at. It has to happen. Now, on the defensive side, quickly, curious to see, Hubbard was released today and announced his retirement, so that's about $9.5 million saved to the cap. Bengals fans aren't going to like it, but Trey Hendrickson has to go. Al Golden was brought in as the defensive coordinator, and his entire resume is built around being able to develop young talent. Lou Anarumo had this defense, which in a way kind of lucked out with a collection of veterans that all understood the complex system and played to it to a very high level and were very adaptable on field in games. He got kind of everything coming together at once and had that electric season where it was just all-time second half adjustments, amazing late in games. Then we saw a couple pieces go away, and his scheme just it didn't adapt to the players on the field. Now you have Al Golden, who is, again, respected for all of the development that he does with these young players and elevating talent. To have Hendrickson going into age 32 in a season where pass rushers fall off of the age curve and we see their performance drop between 4 and 5% in pass rush win rate season over season, to me, it would be silly when you're trying to sort everything out on offense to sign a pass rusher at that age that just goes against the entire defensive philosophy that is seemingly being constructed with the coaching staff going into the season. And so I think Hendrickson needs to go. I want to see what the Bengals are going to do with that. But my God, just get the deal done with Chase and Higgins. It's baffling to me that the Bengals are making it this hard on themselves by extending this as much as they are. Justin Fields expected to be quarterback number 1 for the Pittsburgh Steelers as they debate between Russell Wilson, Justin Fields. One thing's for certain. Neither of these quarterbacks are getting the Pittsburgh Steelers an AFC North title in 2025. It's not happening. All signs point to the Steelers going with Justin Fields as quarterback number 1 coming up into the season. I think it's a divisive decision. I thought that it was going to be a lot more drastic in comparison, in numbers comparisons, in looking at what the offense was with and without Fields and Russ. And I think back to so many of the different shows that I did last year during the season where I was talking about the Steelers offense just being really phony, quite frankly, with Russell Wilson. So much dependence on third down, so much dependence on fourth down, so much dependent on these deep passes, connecting these 50-50 balls. That's what it was. Now, as a bit of a refresher, looking back on Justin Fields, that offense with Fields at quarterback was really, really limited. And so I have a hard time comparing the numbers and getting to a strong conclusion because in one side of my mind, I'm like, well, Russ gets a bit of a benefit because he actually offers some resemblance of a passing game and he offers opportunities. Now, looking at Justin Fields visually, it's like everything was very restricted. Everything was kind of keyed in on him at the quarterback position. The Steelers were running the football a ton. And where I have a difficult time with this is I look back at some of the passing games that Fields had. He was on pace when he was benched after the 6th game of the season for a 3,800-yard and 28 touchdown season throwing the football. Now, with his legs, if you take his first 6 games and extrapolate it out, he would have added 655 rushing yards and 14 touchdowns. From a Pittsburgh Steelers perspective, if they would have got that stat line out of a quarterback, when you think back to how dire the QB scenario was for them last June, July, August, and all the question marks around it, they probably would have signed up for that immediately. And they chose to go to Wilson and go the different direction. And when you compare EPA, success rate, production on field, Fields was leading the Steelers offense to a rank of 18th. Russell Wilson led this offense to a rank of 26th. And it kind of shows how things later in the season for Wilson and this offense really tapered off when those big explosive plays in those high leverage downs were not connecting. And that's just the reality of what it was. Now, the caveat in all of this is strength of schedule was pretty different for both of these. The schedule of defenses that Russ faced, much more difficult than the schedule of defenses that Fields faced. And so the answer is probably that both of these QBs would have had the Steelers over the course of a season if they had the entire starting job basically at the same level. If I'm looking forward and trying to think to 2025, I think the Steelers offense is just going to be incredibly limited if they go with Justin Fields. Russ at least gives you that opportunity of downfield passing. That's not something that we've seen Fields and being able to read defenses consistently and make those big throws from him in his entire career do well. And so either way, it's not a good scenario for the Steelers at quarterback. And it's probably going to be an offense that frustrates a lot of people watching the Steelers going into this season. But it is Mike Tomlin, and somehow he always finds a way to get the most out of these teams. Interesting dilemma for the Steelers, but they're not getting out of the AFC North with either of these quarterbacks. Davante Adams released by the Jets. We're also seeing the entire slew of the Aaron Rodgers crew get sent packing as well. But I'll focus in on Adams because I think that's the most interesting topic to talk about right now. All sense in the world to me lines up for Adams going to the LA Chargers. I don't know if it's incredibly realistic for it to happen. I don't know what the level of intrigue behind the scenes would be for it to happen. There was chatter about Adams favoring teams on the West Coast. LA would certainly fit into that. But at times, amid all of the circus that became Aaron Rodgers and this Jets offense, which finished the season, by the way, I think better than it's given credit for and better than the perception was, there were still routes run by Adams, especially getting off the line of scrimmage and some of his releases, which were quite frankly elite in the NFL. I mean, visually at times, he still looked very much like the receiver that he has been over the last decade in the NFL. There were serious glimpses of that. And to me, inserting that at a cheap price into the Chargers offense, which is just in dire need, right up there with the New England Patriots, of finding any wide receiver talent possible, putting him alongside Ladd McConkey in that offense with Justin Herbert throwing the football to him, I think that has so much upside. And I think that has so much potential. And I'm going to be very curious to see if the Chargers actually are intrigued by doing that and what kind of fit he might have into the team. But man, to me, that makes a ton of sense. And if I'm on the Chargers staff, I'd be going out of my way to try to look at making that happen. But Adams released by the Jets. We're seeing Lazard encourage trade partners, which he is not going to find. Rodgers obviously sent packing as well. So it's a cleaning of house for the New York Jets with Aaron Glenn in as the new head coach. And Davante Adams, I think, still certainly has something left. And I'll be curious to see if he lands in a spot like the LA Chargers, which I think would be very intriguing for the upcoming season. I'll touch on this one quickly. Saquon Barkley extended by the Philadelphia Eagles, $41 million for 2 years. Not uncommon for the Eagles to go and set the market price. Not only is this a bit of a reward for his record-breaking season, but it's also allowing the Eagles to set the market price rather than waiting, having guys like James Cook and other running backs in the league after a big running back draft year kind of elevate that price back up, and then the Eagles are overspending. They elected to set their own price, dictate the market, sign Barkley now, and keep him on the team. Not a lot to offer here from a color perspective. Obviously, you know what you're getting from Saquon Barkley in this Eagles offense. It's as good as it gets. It's as explosive as it gets. And I just think that note of why they did it now perhaps was the most interesting takeaway from this one specifically. Jackson and Thuney signed by the Chicago Bears. This is to me big news because the NFC North is going to be one of the most competitive divisions again in 2025. And this is significant because on the NFL media conference call that had about 450 reporters, it's about 10 or 11 days ago, there was a comment made by someone on the Bears side about how Chicago was in offensive line season. Now, the speculation was on the call that the Bears were going to tackle the draft to address the issues that they have on the interior of the offensive line. Interviews with Ryan Poles postseason suggested that they were maybe going to be more willing spenders in free agency. They go out of their way. They get Jonah Jackson and Joe Thuney in the last 24 hours. And now all of a sudden, this Bears offensive line, which allowed the third most pressures last season and a ton of sacks, turns into a bit of a weapon. There's a few things to talk about here. I'll say first off, the perception of the Bears offensive line, I believe, is worse than it actually is. Ben Baldwin does aggregate offensive and defensive line ratings where he combines a number of stats and then he ranks the teams. The Bears finished 13th in those ratings. I don't think anyone's fully believing visually that the Bears offensive line matches the eye test of being 13th. But if you just ask a collection of 5 random fans of the NFL, I think everybody's going to say that the Bears have one of the worst offensive lines in football, bottom 2, bottom 3. That is largely due to Caleb Williams and how he handles pressure. Pressure to sack rate of Williams was 12% last year. When you look over the course of the league at quarterbacks who had a higher pressure rate, somewhere in that 5 to 6% range is where most quarterbacks fell. Williams' number just completely jumps off the page. He holds on to the football for an eternity. He takes a lot of sacks off of that. It does not matter if you have the greatest offensive line of all time playing in front of Caleb Williams. If he is going to do some of the things that he did last year in the way that he held on to the ball and scrambled around and tried to extend plays that inevitably turned into sacks, he's going to get sacked a ton, and the offensive line pressure metrics are going to look very poor. So that's something to keep in mind as you think about this Bears offensive line. Second thing that I would bring up is I think Ben Johnson is very quickly proving and establishing the culture and style of team that he wants to build. In Detroit, the Lions, as we saw last year, have an elite offensive line. It's been like that for a number of years with Johnson. He very quickly identified it as an issue, did so publicly, and then added 2 veterans to bolster the interior. I think he's very much trying to push forward and replicate a lot of what he had with so much success in Detroit and do so in Chicago. Jackson has familiarity with Johnson and the Detroit Lions scheme, so I think that that's a great fit. Does he end up moving sides to the other side of center? We'll see how they handle that. And then Joe Thuney added, interesting move by the Chiefs. How much of that lingers from the Super Bowl and the playoffs with him switching out and very much underperforming? Did the Chiefs know something that the rest of us don't about Thuney? Or was this entirely contract driven with the Chiefs going younger and resetting? Questions we don't know. Now, when it comes to Joe Thuney, 9 seasons in the NFL, he has started 146 games, only missed 2 starts, and he spent this past season, again, playing guard and left tackle, has the highest pass block win rate in the NFL, regardless of position, the last 2 seasons. A ton of positives for adding him in if there is no validity to the Chiefs knowing something that the rest of us do not. I think that's an easy decision to move him back into the interior for Chicago. It's going to be a massive asset for them to have on the offensive line. Now, there's still a big hole for Chicago at center. Do they continue to free agency spend next Wednesday and go after Drew Dahlman from Atlanta? He's viewed as the best center available on the market. Had a couple of very good seasons in Atlanta. Very athletic at center as well. That kind of fits with the Ben Johnson offensive scheme. In the draft, there's no centers that grade out extremely high. And so when the Bears are picking 10th, I don't know if it's realistic for them to pursue a center. That kind of changes the draft mentality, which is point number 3. Do we see the Bears potentially go with a guy like Genty in the draft as an offensive weapon to add into this offense? You think about what we saw Ben Johnson do with Gibbs. You think about what he did with Monty and revive that. Now you have the offensive line up front, and then you draft the center later on, rounds 2 or 3 perhaps, where there's a little more depth at that position, and you hope that the interior between these 2 veterans, which are signed, kind of elevate that play of center, and then you have this explosive and dynamic running back in the backfield, along with your rookie, now second-year quarterback in Williams, who we saw in his rookie year. make a lot of explosive plays. You've got Roma Dunze, who I think is poised for just a massive season coming up in 2025. I think he's an easy decision on a lot of prop prices. We'll see over for season long. There's a lot of potential and upside for this Bears offense. Brutal division, but man, there's a lot of upside there, certainly for the Chicago Bears. One note before we get out of here and end the live stream and end the podcast, www.footballbetters.com is my new home for NFL content. It is a free email newsletter that I send out a couple of times a week. Did something last week on the 40-yard dash times and the changing of the combine surface that was attached to a prop bet that was available for the 40 times and the betting that came around that, which did hit. I'll be doing a lot of looking at draft props, draft options, ways to bet the draft, breakdowns, things of that nature in the next couple of weeks. I'm also going to have first look at win total projections. I'm going to run win totals for all of the ratings that I have, as well as aggregate ratings, and get a good gauge of strength of schedule and put out some very early win totals. Not really something that you can bet on yet, but it'll give a good gauge of what's going on. So that's to come in the next couple of days. It's a free email newsletter to follow at footballbetters.com. That'll be my new home for football content. I've got some questions. Specifically, I've had a question that I wanted to address from, and I'm going to pull up the name just to make sure that it is correct. Steve Morgan, as well as Terry Stady, were asking, is the simple handicap going to continue? The answer is yes, of course it is. But this venture now to footballbetters.com is an effort to bring everything together. What I will say about 2025 is right now, as we said on March 5th, my expectation is a lot less external and third-party media. Something that I really didn't like from last year was I was doing 7 weekly shows talking about every game on the board, in addition to the Simple Handicap Daily, in addition to other spots. There were so many different media appearances and picks given out in different places and non-picks given out in different places and reactions. It was way too much. It spread the audience way too thin. And I think I lost a lot of interest and intrigue because of it, because quite frankly, the content was probably not as good as it could have been with more of a singular focus. And so bringing everything into footballbetters.com is a bit of a return to how things were 2020, 2021, 2022 with the simple handicap, the community off of that, which is something that I'm hoping to kind of revive in this summer going into the season as well, and just kind of get back to what everybody who's found me over the last couple of years has come to love and appreciate from the content that I do, as a bit of a refresh as well. So if you have yet to sign up for footballbetters.com, would encourage everybody to do so now. It is a free email newsletter, and there's very likely going to be some changes with this YouTube channel, the TikTok account. Already there's the new account on Twitter and X, and just bringing everything together into one home that's easy for everybody to follow, that doesn't have everybody going a million different directions to try figure it out. And it'll just allow me to create better content in one spot for everybody. So that's what's going on with Football Betters, for those of you who don't know. Gerard Morris is in, saying, good morning, Gerard. You're asking about Seattle signing Dahlman. Well, they certainly need help at center. So, yeah, it's, to me, a very highly sought-after prospect that free agent prospect, however you want to look at it. Next week, Wednesday, when the free agency window opens, Seattle needs it. Chicago needs it. A few other teams going after help at center. But I think this is going to be a name that becomes a lot more discussed and a lot more heard about in the next couple of days leading into Wednesday. So he would certainly fit. I'll tell you, just to kind of go off topic here, Gerard, since you've popped into the show, the Seattle coaching changes, very interesting direction that they're taking. And so Mike McDonald last year in a lot of his local radio spots was just reaffirming over and over and over and over again how much he wants to run the football. He wanted to run the football way more than they did. Seattle last year was 3rd in pass rate. They were 5th in pass rate over expectation. And it was kind of Ryan Grubb doing what he knows best. We have to remember, Ryan Grubb was the last offensive coordinator signed of any team last year. Seattle got to building their staff last season so late because they had to wait for McDonald They didn't hire McDonald till February 1st. Grubb was hired, I want to say it was like the 13th or 14th of February. There were no options left. All of the other offensive coordinators were settled by the 5th or 6th of February last year. So McDonald, I think, was kind of forced into that hire. And Grubb is a first-time play caller in the NFL. I mean, typically, if you see that happen and you have an offense that's 15th, 16th in the NFL, you're keeping that guy on. Like, you're like, this is a great foundation to build off of. There's a lot of future here. McDonald fired him so fast. It was within hours of this regular season ending that he was gone. And so it was very clear that Mike McDonald, who is a my way or the highway type of guy, did not agree with what Ryan Grubb was doing with the offense, and he let him go immediately. So there's like check mark number one on direction change. And then you think about these guys that he has now brought in. Clint Kubiak comes in as the offensive coordinator. He's not as run heavy as it's made out to be. He's never had an offense that is top 10 in neutral run rate. That could probably change this year. He's known for the outside zone concepts that go back to his dad, Gary, and obviously Kyle Shanahan, and he's worked with the Niners, and that's exactly the scheme that we are going to see in Seattle. But then you think about these other changes that were made. Justin Elton was added as a run game coordinator. That was a position that did not exist on McDonald's staff last year. You had Benton added as the offensive line coach, who's a 30-year vet of installing run game schemes on the offensive line and worked with Kubiak last season. Rick Dennison is widely renowned as one of the best run game minds in the NFL and has 30-plus years of coaching experience as well. I'm guessing I'm missing a name or two off the top of my head that have been hired on the offensive coaching side that have ties to that. But everybody that has been hired on the Seahawks staff has this run game pedigree that very much fits with what Mike McDonald wants out of his offense. And this could go two different ways. The one way would be a return to 2018 when Pete Carroll hired Brian Schottenheimer and there was the run game mandate put in. Remember the let Russ cook era where everybody was so frustrated because it was run on first down, run on second down, pass on third. It got so bad in 2018 in Seattle that there's now the Cook Index, which is a stat based off of that, which is a reflection of how often teams run the football on first and second down in the first 28 minutes of the game. There's a risk that Seattle goes back to that because in 2017, Seattle was one of the most pass-happy teams in the NFL, and then it was that drastic switch. If you're Mike McDonald and you believe in your defense, which is the side of the ball that you spend the most time focused on, and you just want to condense the game, reduce variance, let your defense win the game, and your offense not cause mistakes and turn the ball over and take risks, you probably see the Seahawks go that direction where it's a ton of running and we see all of these pass game numbers fall to bottom five and the run rate go into top five. That's not really a positive, I would say, as much as running backs and the run game are kind of coming back into popularity. I don't know if you want to go that direction with the Seahawks. My ideal direction, if I'm a Seahawks fan, is that this team goes direction number 2 and builds a really strong play action game foundation around Geno Smith, around DK Metcalf, around Jackson Smith and Jigba. Tyler Lockett is very likely to be let go, whether that's today or tomorrow. I think that's inevitable and coming. You add another skill position player after adding some O-line help. Geno Smith is so good when he's given the opportunity to use play action. Last year, he was seldom given the opportunity to do it at all. His play action rate was bottom 5 in the NFL. And when you look at quarterbacks with more than 400 pass attempts, Geno Smith was 17th of 18th for play action usage. So that was completely taken away from him. In years 1 and 2 with Seattle, Geno Smith had some of the best numbers in the league when given the opportunity to use play action. I think about Clint Kubiak and what he did with Derek Carr last year. Think about some of those games earlier in the season when there were still at least a couple of guys healthy on the field before they were just ravaged with injuries. Some of those deep shots downfield to receivers in this Kubiak offense were so wide open. If you set Geno up for those opportunities with his accuracy, with his play action proficiency, That's a very exciting thing to me for the Seattle Seahawks to try to do. Now, he was really good navigating the pocket last year under pressure. They need offensive line help. I'm curious to see how the Seahawks are going to be talked about in the next couple of months, because they're going to add offensive line help, no question about it. But is that going to be interpreted as completely selling out to go run heavy? I think the answer is probably yes. And I do wonder if there's an element to this underneath where this is actually Kubiak building a really strong play action foundation. Maybe that's really optimistic on my part, but that's, to me, what's going on with the Seahawks right now. It's a very fun team to look at. I think the Seahawks are a fun team to look at. I think the Bengals are really fun to look at, as we talked about earlier. I think the Saints are really fun to look at as well. Cowboys, too. You talk about some run game mandates being put in there, and that's ownership, that's GM, that's, everyone down the line getting at it in. Something to really watch at. We'll obviously talk on that in shows to come. Birdie's talking about Geno. Is it indoor to outdoor splits are just so different? Smith is not an outdoor QB. He's not a fit in Seattle. I've definitely seen those stats. I think TA was the first one to bring them up and really bring those to light. There's noise in that, certainly. He's had some great games outdoors at home. I don't know if I want to label him as indoor versus outdoor. I think what we've seen indoor, this season specifically, let me pull up the Seahawks schedule quickly. The one game, obviously, that comes to mind was the Detroit Lions, where, that game was a shootout from minute one, and the Seahawks were forced into full-on chase mode to play catch-up. And so that obviously led to a big game. But like these other games that we saw Geno Smith play indoors, the Atlanta Falcons, that was the defense that had zero pass rush whatsoever, was very weak on the back end. And so that was a big game for Geno, where the pass rate was high all season long regardless. But you think about that Lions game, which was just a wide-open shootout. The Falcons indoors, again, no pass rush, weak defense on the back end. The Cardinals, very similar, one of the lower-rated defenses in the NFL. Lots of opportunities for Geno in that spot. And then the Rams in the final game of the season, that was probably Geno's least explosive indoor passing game, only threw for 223 yards, but connected on a ton of touchdowns, which skews those. I'm not discounting the stat, Birdie. I'm not going that direction. I agree with the stat. I think every QB league-wide is going to perform better indoors. We see it with Josh Allen as well, where he has just that offense completely flips a switch when they go indoors. And so I think there's some noise to that. I agree with it, certainly. But there is some context that applies to that too. But I think it's a great stat. Very interesting. And you put that in the back of your mind when you're looking at Seahawks totals indoors. In the same way you do with the Bills. You think about some of those Bills totals, like the Lions total was obscenely high. Some of the other indoor games we saw them just got crazy high 50s. So, yeah, great stat. Love that one from TA. And it's there's some context to that I think is important to add too. But I don't think it's an indictment of the Seattle offense overall playing at home. E. Colt says, so excited to fade the Commanders next year. Yeah, I obviously was on the wrong side of a few of those down the stretch. No question. Buccaneers stands out. Was on the right side with that Eagles one to finish, but didn't make up for some of the bad ones down the stretch. I want to run some of these win totals and see what we're looking at with schedule and how this shakes out and what we're going to look at. The biggest comparison that comes to mind for me for the Commanders would be the Texans 2 years ago to last year. They went from the first year of Stroud into the second year of Stroud with a ton of free agency money to spend. They added some big weapons on defense. They added the big name wide receiver. They added these guys, and was the team that much better year two versus year one? I would argue, even though they get to the playoffs again, the answer is probably no. Yeah, look, Cole, I share the same sentiment. It would be hard for me to buy into them long-term over the course of the season, simply because the price is going to be inflated, and there's so many of the overlying luck metrics to carry over from last year into this year that are going to just naturally lead to a willingness to look at the under. But again, Jaden Daniels is elevating this offense to a level that is very likely difficult for the market and guys like myself to catch up to, because you just don't see that often, except with these once in every 5 to 10 year quarterbacks that take a long time to catch up to as a rookie. That I think is a fair question to have. So Birdie's saying that Houston also added a massive big jump in strength of schedule, which I believe is going to be fair for the Commanders as well. I haven't gone into that level of looking yet, but certainly I think is going to fall in line as well with how they finished. Talked about this at the top. I'm not sure if you're around for it, Colt, about how I think the fit actually makes a lot of sense, but whether or not he's able to return to a level of play that represents what he has been is still kind of TBD. So on paper, the fit makes a lot of sense, but it's a matter of what does Deebo have left in the tank, I think is the big question. This was awesome. Thanks for everybody for stopping by. Again, footballbetters.com is the new home for all of the NFL content that I am doing. It is a free email newsletter to sign up for. Obviously here, as well as on the TikTok channel, you'll get videos and live streams consistently. If you're listening on the podcast feed, the podcast is going nowhere. Don't worry about it. For those of you who are concerned about the changes, it'll be tied into everything else that's going on at Football Betters as well. Plenty of updates to come from that. So hopefully see all of you over there subscribe to the free email list, which will be going out consistently throughout the offseason. I will do my best to do these live streams and these podcast updates as often as possible during the offseason when it makes the most sense to do so. I'd love to expand it and do a little bit more, and we'll see what the appetite is for that from a content perspective. And so keep the comments coming in, keep the questions coming in, as always, in these shows. And I'll try to pull all of the topics that you want to hear about the most and tie them into what I think is most interesting as well. Birdie, I'll get to that next one on the next show. But I just want to say thank you for everybody for stopping by again. Have a fantastic Wednesday, guys. And we'll chat to you again soon.